9:30 a.m., Sunday, August 1st, 1915. To the crowned heads of Europe, their armies were the pride of their nation. England did its part by recruiting a total number of 5 million men, some of whom had worked at Brighton works. Some of these men might have even served among the 20,000 numbers of the Royal Sussex Regiment. Although construction and repairs on the locomotives and carriages had been obstructed by the war, and Lancing Carriage Works was suffering a similar problem, the men and their families all understood that there were some sacrifices to be made. In addition, the government seized control of the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway, and its engines had to pull stores and munitions to the soldiers fighting overseas. They delivered their goods to the port of New Haven, where it would be shipped onto boats and taken to the continent. The railway also provided hospital trains for casualties, troop trains for the soldiers who were heading out to Europe by ship. Army horses were stabled at Farlington Racecourse before they could be sent to France, and army camps lay within the railway's territorial areas. It seemed that everyone in the South relied on the LBSCR to reach its maximum potential. Thomas had spent the last month or so preparing for the journey for Sodor, watching the other engines doing their part to help the war effort. But why should he care about war? He was going to a fabulous island he had never heard before, but was promised that it would be wonderful. The LBSCR directors all looked over the trucks that he needed to pull his train, making arrangements with Sir Topham Hatt to make sure that the trucks selected would also be repurposed to serve his new railway. They selected a total of 20 trucks and the luxurious director's saloon to carry 25 soldiers, 1 commander, 2 doctors, and 2 nurses who'd signed on to join the Sodor Regiment, whose own general was offering new recruits from Brighton and other places along the south coast. Carroll Edward, Vere's 21-year-old son, signed up. He knew how much his younger brother had a liking for Thomas and wanted nothing more than to make him happy. As a matter of fact, Wilbert had everything a 5-year-old could possibly want. A mother who was always there to read him Beatrix Potter stories. A father whose duties as a reverend would keep him on the straight and narrow, plenty of toys, fine clothes, a good fire, the servants. Bessie Page, the cook and maid of all work, another cook named Annie King, John Pack the gardener, and a little dog named Sprack. He also had his Aunt Catherine from his mother's side of the family and many cousins from his father's side of the family, as well as his Uncle Charles, who was Vere's brother, and his wife, whom he called Aunt Maggie. They lived at a lavish mansion in Wiltshire that rivaled the humble home of Vere, which had but simple luxuries. Early that morning, Carroll came back from Sandhurst's military academy with good news. It had been raining a little, but his news, in direct contrast, sounded bright and sunny. "I've asked my superiors, and they've decided to let me join the Sodor Regiment. That means you, Mother, and Wilbert can come." Since the start of the war, England's cities were being bombed by German Zeppelins, strange cigar-shaped aircraft invented by and named after Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, which made loud droning noises. At least that's what Wilbert thought they were. This trip to Sodor was a good reason for the family to leave, since it was considered by many to be a safe haven. "Wonderful," was Lucy's reaction. "I should ask Catherine if she would like to come. I should do the same with Charles." "Why him?" "If there's going to be someone from your side of the family going with us, I'll need a compromise. We could even bring his wife and children along." Charles was also a major in the Royal Wiltshire Yeomanry, which around this time was mobilized in the 1st South-Western Mounted Brigade. But Lucy was doubtful. "But Wilbert, I'm not even sure if the coach will have enough room for your nieces and nephews. And what about Sprack and the servants?" "They will be coming too." The family and the servants packed their bags, and a cab took them to the station. By the time they got there, Thomas had already collected the trucks needed for his special train. He had said goodbye to Mr. Billinton, the board members, his brothers, sisters, and the men who built him. The station porters were busy filling his train with many appendages, both necessary and unnecessary, including, but not limited to, practical items like coal, minerals, rations, ballast, parcels, a crate of rifles, cartridges, 4 flatbeds of tracks and sleepers, golf clubs, tennis balls, books, letters, toys, and an 18-pounder gun to be installed at the port of Tidmouth should the enemy invade England by sea. Coal trucks were also attached to the train to give Thomas an extra supply of coal for his bunker. Commandant C.G. Yates of the Brighton Division and Charles Henry Norramby, the Duke of Sodor, watched the soldiers and nurses entering the director's saloon in a straight, organized line. Among those included were Colonel Bruce Seaton, 9th Baronet of Abercorn, and W.H.R. Rivers, a St. John's College graduate, and an anthropologist, known for treating shell-shocked patents. 2 of the traveling were the Bray sisters Mary and Ethel. Their eldest sister, Evelyn, was on the front lines in Northumberland. "Think that's all of them?" the Duke asked Commandant Yates. "As far as I'm told, we're supposed to be taking on some extra passengers." "You'd be correct." The Audreys, plus the servants, Aunt Catherine and Uncle Charles came up, bags in hand. Charles, who was dressed in full uniform, saluted Commandant Yates and Norramby and said, "How do you, Commander?" "Quite fine," Yates saluted back. "How long will be before we reach Sodor? My nephew gets tired easily." Or so that was what Charles thought. "If we don't stop," said Norramby, "I reckon we'll get there at around 5 or 7 sharp." Wilbert, who had been holding his parents' hands for most of the walk, looked up to see the roof of the director's saloon blocking out the sky. Now he felt safe, because he knew that as long as they were moving, they would avoid whatever the Zeppelins had to throw at them. Sprack yapped as he sprinted into the coach, hoping there was a nice meal he could gnaw on, like a piece of chicken or squab. There was some, but that would have to wait until lunch was served 2 hours later. Today seemed like a big day for not just Thomas, but for many other engines and their trains around the station. Off to his left, the Southern Belle spanned 7 Pullman coaches with a graceful sweep of rich brown and gold lining. Opposite of the Southern Belle was a train of 3 suburban coaches filled with new recruits to be headed out to Littlehampton. An ambulance train from New Haven Station pulled in at around 10, pulled by a Terrier-class tank engine named Boxhill. He was sorry to see Thomas go and was prepared to whistle a goodbye as soon as he was off. In addition to wounded soldiers from the Gallipoli campaign, the train also carried officials from St. John Ambulance, who aided the Red Cross in their need to provide a nursing division for extra patients. All began to leave the train and carry the wounded safely to the nearest hospitals and army camps. Brighton Station was looking like a cross-section of the British civilians and armed forces coming together to stop the Hun. As the stroke of midday inched closer and closer, Thomas looked out ahead at the rails that would lead him to Sodor. His eyes looked over at the signal. It was still red. He was already coupled to the train. The seconds ticked by. Then, the bells on the station clock rang. The stroke of noon had arrived. With a triumphant whistle, he pulled away from the platform with strong heaves. The people on the platform waved a jubilant farewell to their loved ones from the other departing trains. But Thomas didn't mind. He knew that people often come first before engines like himself. Photographers clicked away at what would be the last photographs of specific soldiers who would later end up being killed in action behind enemy lines. History was being made as Thomas led the train out of the station and onto the main line. In his mother's arms, Wilbert waved goodbye to Brighton, as did his brother and father. "What's on Sodor?" he asked. "I'm assuming it's magical," Carol Edward teased. "I can only say it is," their father confirmed. "When I was boy like Wilbert, I also met an engine named Skarloey, when your grandfather and grandmother and my brothers and sisters and I would go and see some engines. We went to place where he was built, and the first person he saw was me." "Like me and Thomas?" Wilbert asked. "Exactly like you and Thomas." Veer kissed his son's left cheek. "Well, I just hope we'll meet some nice people there," said Lucy. "Maybe they will have ladies who know how to ride a cycle." As she wrote the current goings in her record book, suitably titled Wilbert Veer Audrey, Record Book, she considered the possibility of writing to her brother Arthur to come for a visit. About an hour later, Thomas stopped at the LBSC's terminal of London's Victoria Station, 51 miles north of Brighton. He waited by the water tower, humming a little ditty while his passengers and the station porter loaded and unloaded a few of the letters and parcels from his special train. Of the 385 letters and postal shipments aboard, half of them were messages from MI5 and the War Department, and over a third of the letters were conscription notices for those who had not yet been drafted into the army. By 1:30, Thomas was ready to be transferred onto the northern section of the London and Northwestern Railway route to Sodor. His whistle and puffs of come along," to the trucks echoed out into the afternoon as he made his way onto the West Coast Main Line via Euston Station. The passengers occupied their time by reading the newspapers, which they bought from a station vendor. Today's news was looking grim. A situation in Constantinople, the Imperial German Army forming a group named after their crown prince, Tirpitz, was training his pirates. But on a positive note, the Mitre Railway in Buenos Aires opened a large railway station called Retiro Mitre, and the chosen government railway in Korea had just finished work on the Hamgyong line, with more sections to be built in the future. Veer never bothered showing any of this to Wilbert for understandable reasons. As the train raced out of London and into the countryside, he held a short service with the passengers reciting the Exodus, which seemed very fitting as they were moving from one place and into the haven of another, just as Moses did with his people all those years ago. With the early morning rain starting to clear away, the sky was blue with a light haze coming from the west. The following day would go down in history as one of the worst torrential rainstorms on Bank Holiday that England had ever seen. Thomas, aware of this, hurried along as fast as his wheels could carry him. He was hoping for a nice dry shed once he got there. The movement of his train was steady with the clacking of the wheels in their rhythmic clack, 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 clack as he traveled on to the north, watching people go about their business and farm boys singing "There's a Long, Long Trail" as they stopped and waved hello to see Thomas go by. The journey seemed like it was off to a good start, but of course railways are not without their dangers. When Thomas stopped at Watford Junction to take on water, a tender engine named Precursor told him about his day. He had been pulling trains all day. So exhausted was he that he missed a red signal. The driver and fireman saw little cause for alarm as Precursor mentioned that he wasn't hurt. After Thomas told Precursor that he was going to Sodor, the engine gave him well wishes, and the signalman informed all traffic from Boxmoor to Wolverton of a special train that was needed to aid the war effort. After finishing a late afternoon snack of cress sandwiches, Wilbert just had to ask, "Are we any closer?" "Only a few more miles," said Veer. "Why don't you take a nap? I can wake you when we get there." "I want to stay up," Wilbur said simply. "You'll be too tried to see Sodor," Veer assured. "So I say the sooner you rest, the better you'll be awake." At Road Station near the Northampton Loop Line, Thomas stopped again to take on water. A while back in 1891, the East and West Junction Railway had been built across this area to serve as a spur line for limestone traffic. It was soon forgotten when a rail line to Stratford-upon-Avon was constructed to connect with the main line. The line before Thomas split in two directions, but even though both lines were following the same route, Thomas took the right to Northampton. At Rugby, he stopped to take on water and coal again. The passengers got out to stretch their legs, and after 10 minutes they were on their way again. It was close to 3:34 when Thomas arrived at Stafford, where he met Orion, the LNWR's number 1957, who was an Alfred the Great class tender engine. "Hello, little tank engine, aren't you a bit far off from the south?" "Actually, I'm heading north, to the island of Sodor," Thomas corrected. "How wonderful," said Orion. "Meanwhile, Sir Claughton has personally asked me to deliver these guns to port. I think the Royal Fusiliers will be needing them over in France." "Is there a port nearby?" asked Thomas. "I'm heading out to Liverpool," said Orion. "You should meet me sometime there." "If I get the chance," Thomas said before puffing away. On board the coach, a copy of Canadian Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae's new poem In Flanders Fields was spoken by every passenger who took their turn. Mr. Norramby led the words first, before it could be memorized by all of the passengers. Even Wilbert was learning to read the rondo with the help of Carol and his parents. This piece of literature, among with the closing line, "We shall not sleep," though poppies grow in Flanders fields, would go on to become one of the most iconic war quotes of all time. At 4:25, Thomas arrived at Crewe, home to a major locomotive facility. In the years that came after, it would be regarded as a fine place for sick engines. The works, known for its insecurity of unemployment, had waned steadily over the years. But Thomas had little time to admire the view. The pressure was on the get to Sodor, because the sun was starting to dip, and with his passengers inside, safe and warm, he continued forwards to the north. At Leyland by 5:15, Thomas learned from an express goods locomotive that Sodor was about 75 miles away. The driver informed the signalman, who informed all traffic leading up to Carlisle, that Thomas's load was important, that he'd get to Sodor as quick as possible. After a drink and some coal, Thomas was on his way again. He had about an hour and 25 minutes before reaching the Vickerstown Bridge. Pressing onwards, the wind died down, and the passengers were watching the sunset from the windows. Lucy and the nurses were looking back on what seemed like a perfect day. The soldiers sang songs, and Mr. Norramby told stories about Sodor, and Commandant Yates ordered a large dinner for everyone. Wilbert's afternoon thoughts were less than worrisome. He was happy to be heading to a new place. At 6:30, Thomas puffed his hardest. "Hurry! Hurry! Hurry!" was his call, as he had heard it from the passenger trains back home. The fireman got his message and fed his boiler with the extra coal from the recently filled coal bunker. After his tanks and bunker would be filled again at Lancaster, Thomas would be prepared to head the train at a maximum percentage of coal and water. At his top speed of 70 miles per hour, Thomas was reaching his full potential, but he knew that speed would always have a disadvantage, as his driver was trying to be patient with his speed at yellow signals. They made one last stop at Lancaster, arriving there at precisely 6:50. A goods engine with a train full of shells and limbers rumbled by as Thomas's tanks were being filled. By now, he was starting to feel the strain of his load. "Don't you think we could rest here for the night?" he asked his driver. "Let's continue on and see what happens." So they did. The day his life changed forever had come to a close, and Thomas was making good time at his top speed. The train was getting heavier by the minute, but he pounded the rails as fast as his wheels would let him. His traction rods were starting to ache from running at a reckless pace, but it barely seemed to matter to him. With his passengers starting to get some sleep, Thomas, smug, confident, and triumphant, was very certain that with Sodor just around the corner, they'd be there by midnight.